There have been a lot of studies or reports that suggest certain deadlines or time frames that are important for climate change, and they're good to keep in mind, but there isn't really one deadline. Climate change is a continuous problem that every day that we emit more carbon dioxide or methane or other greenhouse gases, the climate situation will get worse. And every day where we can stop that, it'll get better. In 2018, the United Nations climate science body, the IPCC, put out a report basically saying that if we kept emitting greenhouse gases on the trajectories we are on, then we would cross a threshold within 12 years, so around 2030, where we would probably exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, no matter what else we did. That amount of warming wouldn't arrive right then, but we would have crossed a point where we couldn't stop that amount of warming from happening. We do have to remember that, even if we cross that threshold, you still need to bring emissions down as rapidly as possible because you don't want to get to 2 degrees or 3 degrees, you want to get 1.51 degrees, 1.52 degrees, because every little fraction will make a difference. So if we do pass that threshold and 1.5 degrees becomes inevitable, or beyond that, some impacts of climate change become much more likely or more severe. A big one of those is the melting of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. The science basically tells us that if we cross certain points, even if we brought the temperature down, chances are we would lose most of those ice sheets. Now, the specific point at which that happens is still up under a lot of scientific research and study. The idea of a deadline is a little misleading because there's not going to be one day where if you fail, okay, now Greenland doesn't have any ice anymore. The worst case scenarios have somewhat narrowed in recent years. There were some pretty big headlines a decade or so ago where people would talk about the potential for not just 1.5 or 2 degrees, but say 4 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees, these sort of runaway global warming scenarios, which are truly kind of impossible to imagine. They're essentially apocalyptic. It seems, based on better science over the years, as well as the world's progress in building solar and wind power and actually reducing some emissions, that those are getting less likely. That doesn't include the fact that we seem to maybe have underestimated some of the extremes that are associated even with those lower amounts of warming. We've already seen some truly outlandish heat waves. For example, the 2021 Pacific Northwest heat wave. The severity of it was such that it basically could only happen once every 10 to 100,000 years. Even as some of those worst case scenarios get less likely, some of the sort of more acute extremes, a heat wave, a flood, those are maybe a little more likely than we thought. The situation is not great, if we're being honest right now. The latest report from sort of the fall of 2022 said that if all of the countries in the world met their pledges, these pledges that countries make under the Paris Agreement of how much they're going to reduce emissions, if all of those pledges were met, the world is still on track for well over 2 degrees of warming, probably something like 2.7 degrees, which most scientists would tell you is pretty catastrophic in terms of the impacts that it will produce. But scientists will tell you it's not out of reach yet. It's still possible, and again, every fraction of a degree matters, and the faster this happens, the better. It's definitely not a situation where you sort of throw up your hands and say, we're screwed. It's more like it's tough, and countries definitely need to do more.